She completely reshaped our modern understanding of freedom. Yet, behind closed doors, she lived a private life filled with shocking, scandalous contradictions. Today, we are exploring the brilliant, deeply complicated story of Simone de Beauvoir. Welcome to Learning English with Rassa.
Okay, let's dive straight into our story, starting in 1908 Paris. Simone was born into a wealthy bourgeois family. She had this really comfortable early childhood, completely filled with books and learning. However, her family's fortunes were absolutely devastated by the economic crash following World War I. And you know, this loss of wealth is the crucial first spark in our story, because it meant Simone could no longer rely on her family's money to secure her future. She literally had to figure out how to survive on her own.
Now picture the intense tension inside her childhood home. Two completely different worlds were colliding. Her mother imposed strict, rigid Catholic rules, expecting Simone to be a traditional, obedient girl. But her father? He was a secular individualist. He loved theater, literature, and pagan ethical standards, and he famously told people that Simone had the brain of a man. This intense clash between tradition and free thinking created a deep conflict in young Simone, forcing her to question absolutely everything she was told.
And that questioning, it quickly reached a breaking point. At just 14 years old, this precocious student lost her Catholic faith entirely and boldly declared herself an atheist. It was a massive rebellion for a young woman at that time. Free from religious rules, she poured all her energy into her mind. She entered the prestigious Sorbonne University in 1926, and by 1929, she became the youngest person ever to pass France's grueling, highly competitive philosophy exam. Now, what is truly fascinating is the famous pact she made during those university years. She met a fellow brilliant philosopher named Jean-Paul Sartre. But instead of a normal romance, Sartre proposed a genuinely radical idea, a soul partnership of total intellectual equality. They agreed to be each other's essential love, the primary, foundational relationship of their lives. But they completely rejected marriage and agreed they were free to take other contingent or secondary lovers.
So, why did she accept this arrangement? We really have to look back at her family's ruined finances. As Simone herself stated, marriage was impossible. I had no dowry. Because she had absolutely no money to offer a traditional husband, a conventional marriage simply wasn't an option. This harsh economic reality fueled her fierce, unstoppable drive to achieve economic independence. If she couldn't marry for security, well, she would just have to earn her own living as a philosophy teacher.
And that is exactly what she did. Throughout the 1930s, Simone used her hard-earned degree to become a teacher in Marseille, Rouen, and eventually Paris. She didn't just teach from textbooks either. She used her classroom to inspire young women to think critically about ethics and their own identities. In a highly traditional society that really expected women to just be quiet wives, she stood in front of the room as a powerful model of female independence and critical thought.
But, this leads us to a really dark and controversial turning point in her story. It's the point where her radical personal life collided with her professional responsibilities. The lines between being a guiding mentor and facing accusations of predatory behavior became dangerously blurred. We have to observe the historical facts impartially here. In 1939, parents accused her of seducing a 17-year-old student named Nathalie Sorokin. Though she was initially dismissed by the occupying Nazi government in 1941 for other reasons, in 1943 her teaching career ended forever. She was formally charged with corrupting Sorokin and her teaching license was permanently revoked. Later, another student, Bianca Bienenfeld, published memoirs detailing similar allegations of grooming and sexual exploitation, claiming she was manipulated by Beauvoir and then essentially passed along to Sartre. The crucial takeaway here is that this permanent suspension irreversibly changed her path. With the classroom closed to her forever, she was pushed to focus entirely on writing. Living through the constant danger of the Nazi occupation, she entered what she called her moral period. She poured all her energy into writing existential philosophy and fiction, desperately trying to understand human responsibility in a dark, oppressive world. Let's jump to 1949 and see how this intense period of writing builds to her absolute masterpiece, a book called The Second Sex. The book is famous for this truly revolutionary quote, "One is not born, but rather becomes a woman." With this single sentence, she argued that gender is actually a social construct. She claimed that society, not biological destiny, forces women into secondary and submissive roles.
The impact of this work was earth-shattering. It was a massive 1,000-page analysis of female oppression. It was so controversial that it was actually placed on the Vatican's Index of Forbidden Books. Yet, it became a massive global success. It cemented her reputation as an autonomous intellectual force completely separate from Sartre, and it literally laid the groundwork for the modern second-wave feminist movement around the globe.
But while her public fame exploded, her private life remained incredibly complex. While maintaining her lifelong intellectual bond with Sartre, she also engaged in profound contingent relationships. She had a deeply passionate romance with the American author Nelson Algren. Later, she fell in love with filmmaker Claude Lanzmann, who is actually the only partner she ever lived with. Toward the end of her life, she legally adopted Sylvie Le Bon, who became her literary heir.
Simone de Beauvoir died in 1986 and was buried right next to Jean-Paul Sartre. She left behind an incredibly complex legacy. She was a philosopher who fiercely championed human freedom and gave women the intellectual tools to liberate themselves, while simultaneously engaging in private actions that were alleged to have deeply damaged the vulnerable people around her. It's a legacy that demands we think critically, just as she taught.
All right, shifting to a warm, deliberate teaching pace, let's analyze our first B2 word from this explainer, precocious. Listen to how that's pronounced, precocious. It means having developed certain abilities at an earlier age than usual. It comes from the Latin word precox, which literally means ripening early. Now, the key distinction here is between being precocious and just being smart. Smart refers to general intelligence, but precocious is specifically about timing. It means you are smart much earlier than society expects. Here are 3 examples straight from our story. Listen closely as I read them and note how the word describes her early brilliance. First, from an early age, Simone was an intellectually precocious child. Second, her precocious mind absorbed complex philosophy long before her peers. Third, the teachers were amazed by the precocious students' logic. In all these sentences, the crucial nuance is the surprising speed of her mental development compared to other children.
Next up is conventional. Listen again, conventional. It means based on what is generally done or believed. It comes from the Latin word convenire, meaning to come together or agree. The distinction you need to remember here is between conventional and normal. Normal just means something is common. But conventional implies that society has actively agreed upon a strict rule or expectation that people are supposed to follow.
Notice how Simone consistently fought against doing what was considered conventional in these story examples. First, Simone's mother held very conventional religious beliefs. Second, she completely rejected the conventional expectations of marriage. Third, the pact she made with Sartre was anything but conventional. See how we use it to describe the strict social rules she was expected to follow but actively chose to break? Our third word is autonomous. Say it with me. Autonomous. It means having the freedom to govern itself or control its own affairs. The root is Greek, autos meaning self, and nomos meaning law, making your own laws. Now, distinguish this from independent. Independent simply means you don't rely on someone else. Autonomous is much stronger. It emphasizes that you have the active power to set your own rules and govern your own life. Listen to how autonomous captures her fierce fight for female independence in these examples. First, she urged women to become autonomous individuals. Second, financial independence made her an autonomous thinker. Third, her goal was to live a fully autonomous life, free from dictation. In this context, earning her own money didn't just make her independent, it made her autonomous, giving her the absolute power to write her own life's rules. Now let's break down contingent. Listen closely. Contingent. It means occurring only if certain other circumstances are the case or dependent on something else. From the Latin contingere, meaning to touch upon or happen. Contrast this with possible. Possible means something can happen. Contingent means it will only happen if a specific condition is met. It is entirely reliant on outside factors. In practice, here is exactly how she and Sartre categorized their romantic affairs. First, Sartre and Beauvoir allowed each other to have contingent lovers. Second, her relationship with Nelson Algren was a passionate contingent love. Third, they believed contingent relationships provided necessary freedom. They used this highly specific word to show that these other lovers were secondary, entirely dependent on the fact that their primary essential relationship was already secure. Moving on, we have controversy. Listen to the stress, controversy. It describes a prolonged,
public and heated disagreement. It comes from the Latin controversus, which means turned against. The key distinction here is between controversy and an argument. An argument is usually between two individuals or a small group. A controversy is massive. It involves the public, society, and widespread debate over a very long period. See how controversy followed her through both her published writing and her private actions. First, her book, The Second Sex, generated massive public controversy. Second, her suspension from teaching was shadowed by dark controversy. Third, she never shied away from political controversy during her life. It highlights how her actions didn't just cause small arguments, but massive, society-wide shockwaves.
Our sixth word is emancipation, pronounced emancipation. This is a powerful noun. It refers to the fact or process of being set free from restrictions. From the Latin emancipare, meaning to free from control. You really must distinguish emancipation from freedom. Freedom is the final state of being free. Emancipation is the actual action, the struggle, or the legal process of getting that freedom.
These moments perfectly demonstrate her belief that true freedom requires systemic liberation. First, she became a leading supporter of women's emancipation. Second, the book acted as a roadmap for female emancipation globally. Third, economic freedom is the first step toward true emancipation. She wasn't just talking about the concept of freedom, she was writing a literal guide for the active emancipation of women from social rules.
Let's dive into ambiguity. Listen closely. Ambiguity. It means the quality of being open to more than one interpretation. It comes from the Latin ambiguous, meaning doubtful or wandering. Let's distinguish this from confusion. Confusion means you simply don't understand the facts. Ambiguity means you understand perfectly, but there are multiple valid meanings or a lack of clear moral boundaries. It is intentionally not black and white.
Let's observe how she both wrote about and actively lived a life full of unclear moral boundaries. First, she wrote an entire essay on the ethics of ambiguity. Second, we must have the courage to dwell in the ambiguity of her life. Third, her legacy is filled with moral ambiguity and contradictions. Her life cannot be neatly categorized as purely good or purely bad. It exists in that complex gray area of ambiguity. Word number 8 is exploitation, pronounced exploitation. It's a heavy word, meaning the action of treating someone unfairly in order to benefit from them. Rooted in the French word exploiter, meaning to use for profit. The difference between abuse and exploitation is very specific. Abuse is causing physical or mental harm. Exploitation specifically means you are taking advantage of their vulnerability to get a personal benefit, profit, or pleasure for yourself.
As we unpack the dark realities of the allegations made against her, pay attention to how this word applies. First, former students accused her of sexual and intellectual exploitation. Second, the three of them engaged in an exploitative relationship. Third, her theories oppose the exploitation of women in society. The tragic contradiction here is that while her books fought societal exploitation, her personal actions were accused of exploiting the youth and trust of her own students. Next is radical. Listen, radical. It means relating to or affecting the fundamental nature of something, being very thorough. The root is the Latin word radix, which means root. Let's distinguish radical from extreme. Someone can take an extreme action that is just very severe. But a radical action means you are pulling something up by the roots. You are changing the fundamental, structural foundation of an entire system.
Notice how completely she upended traditional, accepted ways of living and thinking. First, the pact she proposed was a truly radical idea for the 1930s. Second, her claim that gender is a social construct was a radical shift in thought. Third, she maintained a radical independence throughout her entire career. Her ideas didn't just tweak society a little bit. They were radical, aiming to pull up the very roots of how men and women lived.
Our final word is legacy, pronounced legacy. It refers to something transmitted from the past or the lasting impact a person leaves behind. From the Latin legatus, meaning an ambassador or envoy. Distinguish legacy from memory. A memory is just what we remember in our heads. A legacy is the tangible impact, the books, the social changes, the actual inheritance that continues to affect the world long after the person is gone.
Here is how the world continues to interact with the history she left behind. First, Simone de Beauvoir left behind a massive feminist legacy. Second, her legacy is complicated by the allegations of harm toward her students.
Third, we cannot capture her entire legacy with just one single book. Her legacy is alive today, actively shaping modern thought, even as we continue to debate the darker parts of her life.
All right, let's take a breath and slowly recap our first 5 words. We started with precocious, meaning early development, distinct from just being smart. This linked perfectly to her passing those brutal exams so young. Then conventional, the strict social rules she rejected, unlike mere normal habits. Third was autonomous, highlighting her drive for self-governing rules, which is way stronger than simple independence. Fourth, contingent, meaning dependent on something else, which is exactly how she defined her secondary lovers. And fifth, controversy, the massive public disputes she caused, going far beyond a simple argument.
Moving right along to our final 5 words. Emancipation is the active process of getting freedom, not just the state of it, which she charted in her books. Ambiguity describes the valid multiple interpretations of her deeply complex morals. Exploitation is taking unfair advantage for personal profit, distinct from general abuse, linking to those tragic student allegations. Radical refers to changing the absolute roots of society. And finally, legacy, the lasting, tangible impact she left on the world, much heavier than a simple memory. Take a moment to ensure you have a rock-solid grasp of this B2 vocabulary in the context of our story.
Now that we've nailed down the vocabulary, let's learn a highly practical B2 idiom tied directly to this story: blur the lines. The meaning of blur the lines is to make it difficult to distinguish between two different things, ideas, or rules. The logical root comes directly from drawing or painting. If you draw a sharp line between two colors, they are clearly separate. But if you smear or blur the ink, the two colors mix, and you can no longer tell where one ends and the other begins. We use this in English to describe situations where rules or moral boundaries become messy and unclear.
So how do we actually use this naturally in a conversation? You might say, in an office, working from home really blurs the lines between my professional life and personal life. In our story, Simone famously blurred the lines of morality. She was a teacher and a mentor, but by engaging with her young, vulnerable students, she completely blurred the lines between being a trusted educator and facing allegations of being an exploitative predator. For your practice challenge, think of a time in your own life where the rules weren't clear. Write a sentence using blur the lines to describe it.
And that brings us to the end of our explainer. I want to leave you with this final provocative thought. How do we evaluate a thinker whose radical ideas advanced human freedom, yet whose personal actions exploited the vulnerable? Can we separate the brilliant philosophy from the flawed philosopher? I invite you to share your answers and practice your new vocabulary with us on our Telegram channel at @FluentMind. Keep learning, keep questioning, and I will see you in the next explainer.